The TCL 20 Pro is the latest Snapdragon 750 powered phone, retailing for about $500. But so is the Samsung Galaxy A52 5G. Which has the better cameras? Let's find out. How's it, Grant here, and welcome to, this mid-range phone camera battle. You've got the TCL 20 Pro and the Samsung Galaxy A52 5G. Both are powered by the Snapdragon 750G chipset and are both retailing for about $500 here in the US. They also both have similar quad camera setups on the back. You've got the TCL 20 Pro with its 48 megapixel main sensor with optical image stabilization. The A52 5G also has a 64 megapixel main sensor, also with OIS. They both have ultra-wide angle cameras as well as macro cameras and a depth sensor. So very similar camera setups, very similar price points. I think this is going to be a very good matchup here. So like I usually do, I'm going to show you a bunch of photos and videos in both good and low light conditions to help you decide which of these two camera systems might be best for you. So go ahead and check out all the photos and videos, and I'll wrap this up with my thoughts. Alright, so we're in the park testing the video on the TCL 20 Pro and the Galaxy A52 5G. This is the ultra wide angle lens on each to start out with here. So I'll just pan around to give you a feel for what these ultra wide angle lenses look like. And we actually have some clouds here. We don't usually always get clouds, so you get a little bit of a test of some of that dynamic range here on both of these phones. Also check out the greens and the blues for color reproduction and any differences you've seen between the two. So again, this is the ultra wide angle to start out with on each of the phones. And we're back with the main wide angle lens on each. I had to stop the video because the TCL 20 Pro doesn't allow me to switch lenses while recording between the ultra wide and the normal standard wide angle lens. So again, here is the main lens on each of the two phones. I'll pan around to give you a feel for what that looks like here on each. And we'll pan over here to the right and we'll test zoom here out on that cell tower. So let's go into maybe 2x digital there on the TCL 20 Pro and likewise on the A52 5G. And we can move all the way up to a 10x digital zoom on the TCL 20 Pro. And we can move all the way to a 10x digital as well on the A52 5G. Looks a little bit clearer on the A52, at least in the viewfinder. Looks a little more grainy on the TCL 20 Pro. And we'll go ahead and back this out to the 1x on each. And let's go ahead and test zoom here on the post with the TCL 20 Pro first. And there we go, focused up and away refocused. So pretty snappy autofocus here on the TCL 20 Pro. Actually locks in pretty good and refocuses away as well. So let's try the A52 5G. And one more time. There we go. And again, so now it's locked into focus and refocusing away pretty well as well. I think the 20 Pro might be a little snappier there. And let's go ahead and test stabilization, which there is no stabilization at 4K here on the A52 5G. The TCL 20 Pro does have EIS, so you should see some stabilization there right now. And I'll pull up here and we'll pan up into the sky to see how these phones handle that changing afternoon light. Alright, so we're back in full HD 1080p because I want to do a stabilization test here on each because the A52 5G does have stabilization at 1080p and so does the TCL 20 Pro, still has EIS just like it did at 4K. So there's a quick stabilization test here on each of the two phones at 1080p. Okay, both phones have a super steady mode, so we're going to test that out. Obviously I'm just walking right now. I'll start jogging so we can test the stabilization and really stress it out here. Let's try it out. So there's a quick test of the super steady mode on each of the phones.
That's how I got that heat, let's go.
So here's some front-facing video from the TCL 20 Pro and A52 5G. This is at 4K 30 frames per second, and the A52 5G is not stabilized in 4K on the front, just like it is not on the rear. The TCL 20 Pro does have EIS on the front if you turn it on. I got it turned off because it puts a crop on the image. So right now you can see that they're both about the same field of view here on each of the two phones. So let's go ahead and pan around so you can see the difference here in the image quality as the lighting conditions change. You already saw what it looked like with the sun in the background there. Pretty much any phone's going to blow that out because it really wants to focus on the subject, which is right now me. And we'll keep panning around so you can kind of see what that does. You can see some of the lens flares come in from the changing sun. But we'll go ahead and start walking so you can see there is no stabilization. And this is probably looking a little bit shaky, but you can fit more in the frame. So this is probably a good option to keep EIS off on the TCL 20 Pro if you want to fit more in the frame and you're doing more kind of stationary filming. Alright, so we're back at 1080p full HD because the A52 5G is stabilized at full HD 1080p here from the front-facing camera, just like it is on the rear. And the TCL 20 Pro can stabilize even at 4K, but I want to keep the resolution the same. And they turn EIS on, so they both have the same crop on it. And you'll start to see that they're both fully stabilized here at 1080p. But like I said, the TCL 20 Pro can stabilize if you turn on EIS at 4K as well. The A52 cannot do that at 4K, only at full HD or below. So there's a quick sample of the stabilization on the front-facing camera on both of these phones. Everyone, so here's some low light video at 4K 30 frames per second, starting out with the ultra wide angle camera on each. So I'm just going to pan around to give you a feel for what this looks like here. And you can see the light, that really bright street light is not being flared out too much because this is the ultra wide angle lens. It's not bringing as much light, and so it's not going to flare out things, but it's also going to be a little bit darker than when I switch to the main angle lens in just a little bit. And here's now the main wide angle lens on each. So this is the primary lens on each of the cameras here. You can see it's a little bit brighter, letting in a lot more light. You can actually see the trees a little bit more against that skyline where they're blended in with the ultra wide angle lens before. And at least in the viewfinder, the A52 is really flaring out these lights a lot. And so I'm not sure if it's any better in post. But at least in the viewfinder, it's almost a little bit too intense there. But let's go ahead and pan around this way and we'll walk here. As you can see, the A52 5G is not stabilized here at 4K, so this is probably looking pretty shaky, while the TCL 20 Pro does have stabilization at 4K. And so that should be looking a lot more stable, but maybe a little bit darker. And as you round the corner, you're going to see it get a lot darker here. And at least to the viewfinder, from what I'm seeing, they're both looking about the same as far as brightness. And then we'll pull up here and we'll pan up into the sky. That's kind of dark, but there's a little bit of light pollution, so it's not pitch black, if you're wondering what it really looks like out here. And I'll pan around this way to the left where there's a little bit mixture of a dark alley with a little bit light, so maybe more of a mixed light situation here. So that's what low light video looks like here in 4K on both phones. And here we go with some 1080p full HD footage. Now the A52 does have stabilization, and the TCL 1020 Pro is still stabilized here at 1080p. I also want to show you this because 1080p footage tends to be a little bit brighter, so I'll not only test stabilization, but see if you notice any kind of a difference in the brightness of the video or not. We'll pan up into the sky again, and at least through the viewfinder, surprisingly it doesn't look any brighter than it did at 4K. It usually looks a little bit brighter at full HD 1080p, but we'll pan on this way, and maybe a little bit, but not what I'm seeing through the viewfinder. It could be changed a bit in post, but there's some quick 1080p footage, and so you can see some stabilization on that A52. So here's some low light video at 4K 30 frames per second. The TCL 20 Pro has stabilization on, so it's going to have a bit more crop than the A52 5G, which has no stabilization at 4K, and there's no option to turn that on or off. You just don't have any stabilization at 4K at all on the A52. And so obviously I'm in some ideal lighting conditions out here. I want to show you what these cameras can do and the most optimal lighting conditions in a bit of low light here. You can see the lights all around me as well as the back of me and how they're handling that, if they're flaring them out at all. So we're going to start walking to test stabilization so I can see what that looks like here in 4K on the TCL 20 Pro. Obviously the A52 5G is probably looking a little bit jumpy. So we'll test some 1080p coming up with stabilization on so you can kind of see what that looks like in low light. But I did want to test this out because the TCL 20 Pro does have stabilization at 4K. So it's only fair to test that out here up against the natural state of the A52 5G, which has no stabilization. And I do have a fountain to my right, so we'll test out the microphones and how that cancels out that sound or not against the sound of my voice. And as we pan this way, the lights are much brighter behind me, lots of bright street lights over there. And the A52 is flaring them out a little bit more, at least what I'm seeing in the viewfinder. And we'll walk over here into the darker area, so you have a side-by-side view of what this looks like here in 4K on each of these phones. And we're going to switch into some 1080p so you can see what that looks like in low light. And here we are in 1080p full HD on both phones. You'll notice they both have about the same amount of crop. Stabilization is on both of these. And so you can see how this looks like here in this darker area, if it looks a little bit brighter or not than the 4K footage that you just saw. But I'll go ahead and walk a little bit just to show you the stabilization on the A52 5G and how that compares to the TCL 20 Pro here in full HD. But let me know what you think about how these cameras performed, all the photos and videos, which ones you preferred. Quick summary for me, I actually like the TCL 20 Pro for daytime photos and for its video stabilization because you can stabilize all the way up to 4K. But pretty much everything else I preferred on the A52 5G. I think the video quality looks better, and the fact that it has nightscape or night mode on all the lenses. The TCL 20 Pro only has night mode on the main lens. You can't use night mode on the front-facing camera or the ultra wide-angle camera at night, so low light definitely goes to the A52 5G. But like I said, daytime photos, I was actually surprised. TCL 20 Pro, much improved, a lot less saturated than the TCL 10 Pro from last year, even with AI mode on. And it's a lot more true to life colors than the A52 had, and actually pretty sharp with a good amount of detail. So that's just what I think in my quick thoughts here between the two phones. So do let me know what you think, which one you preferred, and we'll continue our conversation down there. As always, thanks for watching.